South Korean military says the inter-Korean buffer zones under the 2018 military pact no longer exist, citing a series of rule violations by North Korea, including the recent live-fire drills near the maritime border. The South Korean economy yet again shows signs of improvement on the back of a recovery in chip production, says the nation's economic think tank. Some of the big winners of the 2024 Golden Globe Awards night were Steven Yeun and Ali Wong for Netflix Beef, becoming the first actors of Asian descent to win in their categories. Beef itself won Best Television Limited Series. It's January 8th, 2024. This is Newscenter. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. For the past 3 days, North Korea has fired artillery shells into waters off its west coast, raising tensions on the Korean peninsula. In response, the South Korean military has declared the buffer zone to prevent accidental clashes is no longer valid. This could mean the military agreement signed 5 years ago is practically scrapped. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji has our top story.
On September 19, 2018, the two Koreas signed an inter-Korean military agreement that set up buffer zones for land, air, and sea to reduce tensions and prevent accidental clashes. But following the North's recent provocations, the South Korean military officially declared on Monday that these zones outlined in the agreement are no longer effective.
North Korea has breached the September 19 military agreement more than 3,000 times, and over the last 3 days, it has fired artillery shells in the West Sea. As a result, the zone where all hostile activities are banned no longer exists.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff also said the military will not respond to every provocation initiated by North Korea, and instead conduct firing exercises according to its own schedule. The maritime buffer zone in the West Sea extends 135 kilometers. That's 85 kilometers south of the NLL, or the northern limit line that separates the two Koreas, and 50 kilometers north of the line. There's also a separate buffer zone in the East Sea that spans 80 kilometers. Provocative actions are prohibited in these zones, including firing artillery shells and coastal guns. The North had already said last November that it's withdrawing from the pact, and it has rebuilt guard posts inside the DMZ. With South Korea's announcement on Monday, the agreement is now practically scrapped. This comes after the South Korean military detected around 90 artillery shots by the North on Sunday afternoon. North Korea also fired over 200 shells on Friday and 60 on Saturday. However, in an attempt to shame the South Korean military's detection capabilities, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, claimed the North had not fired a single shell on Saturday, but instead detonated explosives simulating the sound of artillery fire. The South Korean military immediately dismissed the statement, calling it a, quote, comedy-like propaganda. In fact, according to military sources, the South Korean military detected the North blowing up explosives only 10 times before and after Saturday's shelling, which shows the North's claims are not true. An expert says the intention behind North Korea's latest provocation is to grab local and international headlines.
In a world distracted by Gaza and Ukraine, that North Korea is saying we're still here and we're starting the year with these types of artillery rounds. That garners a lot of international attention.
Arirang News.
South Korea's National Intelligence Service today confirmed suspicions that Hamas is using North Korean weapons in its war with Israel. This follows a Voice of America report last Friday about the use by Hamas of a North Korean-manufactured F-7 rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The report included a photo of the F-7 grenade launcher, which had Korean characters on it. The NIS concurred with the report and added it is gathering related evidence. Meanwhile, Pyongyang has denied these allegations, labeling them as groundless and accusing the U.S. of false charges. Turning to the Middle East war, Israeli military officials are touting gains on the battleground against the Palestinian militant group, highlighting their destruction of Hamas's militant command in northern Gaza. Lee Seung-jae has the latest.
The Israeli military said Sunday that it has destroyed Hamas command in northern Gaza, adding that the army has killed at least 8,000 militants in the area. According to Israel Defense Forces spokesperson Daniel Hagari, Hamas is now operating in the area only sporadically and without commanders. He added that they are now focusing on dismantling the militant group in southern and central Gaza. Despite visits by diplomatic leaders from the U.S. and the EU, tensions in the Middle East continue to rise, with reciprocal attacks between Israel and Lebanon's pro-Iran armed faction Hezbollah. According to Reuters and CNN, Hezbollah announced that it fired 62 missiles at Mount Meron Air Base in northern Israel on Saturday, which it called a response to the assassination of senior Hamas leader in Beirut last week. The Israeli military said Sunday that it responded to the attacks by deploying fighter jets to bomb Hezbollah facilities in southern Lebanon. U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken and High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Joseph Borrell made trips to the Middle East as they tried to quell the tensions in the region. Meanwhile, the Qatari Prime Minister says the assassination of a high-ranking Hamas official, Saleh al-Aruri, in Beirut last week affected efforts to mediate a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. However, the Prime Minister vowed to continue mediation efforts. Hamas halted all ceasefire and hostage release negotiations with Israel after the death of its senior leader. A number of Hamas officials, including al-Aruri, were killed in a drone attack in Beirut. U.S. officials have pointed to Israel for conducting the attack. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
The Korean economy yet again shows signs of improvement thanks to a recovery in chip production. This latest promising assessment comes from a state-run think tank. Our economics correspondent Lee Soo-jin has more.
South Korea's economy is showing signs of improvement. That's according to the Korea Development Institute in a report released by the economic think tank on Monday. The slowdown in the economy is easing as the semiconductor industry recovers. Industrial production in November surged by 5.3% on year, largely driven by the increase in chip production. Chip production saw a sharp rise of more than 42% from the previous year on increased demand for AI servers. A rise in chip demand also contributed to a rise in overall exports, which were up 7.7% in November compared to the previous year. Exports overall in December were up 5.1% compared to the year before, and while that gain wasn't quite as big as in November, the increase was larger when adjusted for the number of working days. Chip exports rose by some 21% on year last month. And car exports were up nearly 18%, mainly on the back of increased demand for eco-friendly cars. But the economy still faces headwinds as consumption and investment remain sluggish due to ongoing high interest rates. Retail sales continue to show an on-year decline in November of 0.3%, and while this was a smaller decline than the previous month, this was mostly due to the base effect and temporary auto sales. And equipment investment in November dropped even further from the previous month to around 12% on year. In terms of the global economy, the KDI stated that growth is gradually slowing as production and consumption remain sluggish amid high interest rates. Over in the United States, while there was a rise in both consumption and investment, it is expected that the U.S. will see a gradual slowdown due to reduced government spending and monetary tightening. In China, the real estate market continues to see a dip in home prices despite economic stimulus policies, raising the possibility of slower growth. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
On the local trade front, Korea raced past its target goal for overseas construction orders last year, bolstered by big contracts from the Middle East. Our correspondent Moon Hye-ryun reports.
South Korea's overseas plant orders last year surpassed the goal of $30 billion with a boom in orders from the Middle East. The Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy announced on Monday that the total came to $30.23 billion, up 25% compared to the year before. It's also the highest sum recorded since 2015, and it was a $1.5 billion contract to build a floating LNG vessel in Canada at the end of last year that tipped the total over the target for 2023. The ministry attributed the success to effective sales diplomacy in the Middle East, particularly the two summits between South Korea and Saudi Arabia held in November 2022 and October last year, which resulted in large-scale plant construction orders. The boom in the Middle East was reflected in the data. More than a third of all overseas plant orders last year were from the Middle East. The largest overseas order recorded last year was also from Riyadh, with Hyundai Engineering and Construction's $5 billion agreement to build a mega petrochemical plant for its state oil company. This is also the most expensive contract won by any South Korean company so far in Saudi Arabia. The United States came in a close second in terms of the percentage of overseas plant orders, as South Korean companies responded to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act by localizing their production of electric vehicle parts. By country, the U.S. was also where South Korean firms secured their greatest sum of construction orders. It is the first time since data was first compiled in 1965 that the U.S. has been South Korea's top market for construction orders. An increase in exports of equipment such as semiconductors, batteries and display screens to the U.S. also contributed to the country's overseas orders meeting its target. This year, the government's goal for overseas plant orders is higher than last year's at $40 billion. For overseas construction orders, the country surpassed the $30 billion mark for the fourth year in a row, with $33.3 billion, just short of its $35 billion target. The government will be offering tailored support for companies during each stage of the contracting process to keep riding the Middle East boom. The country's Deputy Trade Secretary said that the ministry would do its best to strengthen export growth, especially with increasing demand in new industries such as decarbonization. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
The country takes a step towards launching its ambitious space agency. This as related bills got a green light from a parliamentary committee today that sets the legal basis. Our National Assembly correspondent Lee Si-hoo explains.
South Korea is one step closer to launching a new space agency. The National Assembly Science and ICT Committee on Monday passed bills to establish a new space agency that the Science Ministry has dubbed the Korea Aerospace Administration, or KASA. The bills passed are the Special Act for the establishment and operation of the agency and the revision to the existing Space Development Promotion Act. According to the bills, the new space agency will carry out policymaking, industry promotion, international cooperation, and more in the field of aerospace. It will start with fewer than 300 personnel but will grow its size through active recruitment. The agency will fall under the Ministry of Science and ICT and will also be monitored by the National Space Committee. The existing Korea Aerospace Research Institute and Korea Astronomy and Space Science Institute will now belong to the new agency, but the physical transfer of the institutions will require approval by the parliament. Both KARI and KASA will carry out research and development. The two main parties had conflicting views on this, with the ruling People Power Party insisting the space agency should carry out R&D projects that KARI is unable to, and the main opposition Democratic Party opposing this idea, saying it would create unnecessary overlap. The lawmakers eventually agreed to allow KARI to carry out its existing research and KASA to carry out other R&D projects. If the bills are approved at the plenary session on Tuesday, the space agency in Sacheon, Gyeongsangnam-do Province could start operations as early as May. Lee Si-hoo, Arirang News.
On the cultural front, the annual U.S. Golden Globe Awards took place in Los Angeles on Sunday local time. For the event's highlights, here is our culture correspondent, Song Yu-jin.
Hollywood's star-studded award season has kicked off, starting with the Golden Globes. The 81st edition of the annual awards, which celebrates the best in TV and film, was held Sunday local time at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Beverly Hills, California. Netflix's comedy drama Beef made history. Steven Yeun and Ali Wong became the first actors of Asian descent to win in their categories. Yeun, a Korea-born American actor, clinched Best Performance by a Male Actor in a Limited Series, Anthology Series, or a Motion Picture made for television, while Wong won in the female category. Yeun joked that there are some similarities between him and his character in Beef, while Wong spoke of her surprise.
I'm a respectful but skillful and at times aggressive driver. I live in LA, so I drive the same, not that different from Danny. That's not illegal.
I mean, I think I was just really surprised. This is a really fancy event with a lot of fancy people.
Beef continued its triumph, winning a third Globe with Best Television Limited Series. Adding to the Globe's history was Lily Gladstone becoming the first Indigenous person to win Best Performance by a female actor in a motion picture drama.
So every time I've felt a level of guilt or feeling like it wasn't really possible, my mom and my dad, my whole life, they've never once questioned that this is what I was meant to do.
Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer was the top winner of the night. The 3-hour biography of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer picked up 5 awards, including Best Motion Picture Drama and Best Director.
I think the tragedy and what drew me to the story is that certainly in the later part of his story, post-World War II, post-Trinity, he always maintained his loyalty to his country, what he needed to do, never apologized for what he did.
Greta Gerwig's Barbie clinched the inaugural cinematic and box office achievement along with Best Original Song. This new award recognizes films based on box office sales and digital streaming viewership. With the Golden Globes now over, up next is the 75th Emmy Awards on January 15th. 송유진, Arirang News.
On the tech front, researchers here have found a way to address wrinkles on screens of foldable phones. Our Chung Won-ju tells us how.
Foldable smartphones can flexibly adjust to various sizes. While their overall performance has improved in recent years, the visible creases on the screen persist as a significant drawback. In response, South Korean researchers have developed touch panels that remain wrinkle-free even after repeated crumpling or folding. It consists of 3 layers, a shape memory polymer capable of adjusting flexibility from softness to firmness up to 700 times, combined with layers of silver nanowires and elastomer. The crumpled touch panel maintains rigid, but when a current is applied, the silver nanowires act as a heating element, softening the surface and making the wrinkles disappear. When heat was applied to a crumpled touch panel, the wrinkles vanished within a second. Touch performance was also maintained as the electrodes reconnected.
When the touch panel is crumpled, artificially applying heat softens the shape memory polymer, simultaneously eliminating the wrinkles.
The researchers developed the touch panel after being inspired by how a butterfly spreads its wings. The touch panel maintained its initial performance by over 95% and demonstrated durability in experiments involving folding and unfolding the panel more than 800 times.
After the butterfly's metamorphosis, its bodily fluids evaporate, gradually causing the wings to unfold. Our research team paid attention to this phenomenon.
The researchers are continuing further research to develop wrinkle-free displays by combining them with polymer-based luminescent components. The research results have been published in Nature Electronics, an international journal of electronic engineering. Chung Won-ju, Arirang News.
Time now to take a look at what's been happening in the world of sports. Joining us in the studio is our sports editor, Paul Need. Hello, Paul.
Hello there.
Let's first start with football and the AFC Asian Cup in Qatar. Just 1 week to go now until South Korea's men's team play their first match.
Yes, you're quite right. And as part of their preparation, South Korea on Saturday in Abu Dhabi beat Iraq 1-0 in a friendly match. Lee Jae-sung got the game's only goal 5 minutes before the interval, Sol Gwang-woo with the assist. It was something of a rotated lineup with Kim Min-jae, Son Heung-min, Cho Gyu-sung, Hwang Hee-chan and Lee Gang-in all named on the bench. Jung Woo-young and Oh Hyung-kyu, among others, were given a chance to impress. But for Lee Gang-in, the PSG star came off the bench but was sent off late on after picking up 2 yellow cards. but he has been picked by the AFC's official website as one of the top 5 young stars at the tournament and as the potential successor to the legendary Park Ji-sung. Also, he won't be suspended for Korea's first game against Bahrain next Monday, despite that red card. But the game is Korea's first meeting with Bahrain since the 2019 Asian Cup, a 2-1 win in the round of 16. Korea are looking to win their first Asian Cup in 64 years.
Fingers crossed. And moving on to golf now, I understand Im Sung-jae has set a new birdie record.
He has, yes. 34 birdies is a new PGA Tour record for a 72-hole tournament. And it was set at the Century in Hawaii over the weekend, where Im finished in the tournament's top 10 for the 3rd time in his career. The previous record for birdies was 32. Im shot 11 of them on the final day to finish tied for 5th, 25 under par, 4 strokes behind the winner Chris Kirk. Meanwhile, fellow Korean Am Byung-hun finished 4th, just 3 strokes behind Kirk. Up next in the PGA calendar is the Sony Open, also in Hawaii, on January the 11th.
Moving on to figure skating, a championship win for Shin Ji-a.
Yes, the 2nd time in a row now for her at the 78th National Figure Skating Championships. In the free skate on Sunday, Shin Ji-a earned a technical score of 80.66 and an artistic score of 68.62 to give her a total of 149.28 for the day. Combined with her scores from the previous day for a total of 218.36, Shin won the competition for the 2nd time in a row. Now, usually the top 3 earn a spot at the ISU World Championships, but because Shin is just 15, she will instead compete in the Junior World Championships in Taiwan next month. Meanwhile, Lee Hae-in, who finished in 2nd, does qualify, and Yu Yong returns to the national team after a 1-year absence and also qualifies, as does Cha Jun-hwan, who, despite an ankle injury, finished 1st in the men's free skate.
And finally, to baseball now. We now know when the new KBO season will begin. When is it?
March 23rd, so do mark your calendar for that. But this is actually more than a week earlier than last year, and according to Yonhap News, is because of a new international tournament that's scheduled for November. But the Korea Baseball Organization made the announcement of the new schedule last Wednesday. The top 5 teams from 2023 will start the new season with home games, but the exception is the Doosan Bears because they share Jamsil Stadium with the champions LG Twins, and so will be away from home on the first day, heading to the South Coast to face the NC Dinos. The Twins, meanwhile, will entertain the Hanwha Eagles in the capital. In terms of some other key dates, the All-Star game will be on July the 6th, and the mid-season break around that time in July has been reduced from 7 days to 4.
All right, Paul, thanks for the wrap-up. I'll see you next week.
Thank you. See ya.
The cold snap, which began with Soan last weekend, reached its peak today. Fortunately, the cold will ease off as the temperatures rise tomorrow. However, instead of the cold spell, we need to prepare for heavy snow. Snow will fall again in the northwest, including Seoul, tomorrow morning. The snow will gradually expand to other parts of the country in the afternoon. Heavy snow of up to 20 centimeters is expected in the mountainous areas of Gangwon-do province, up to 15 in the inland areas of Gyeonggi-do province, and up to 10 centimeters in Seoul. Therefore, it's necessary to prepare thoroughly and use public transport as there are concerns about traffic chaos caused by icy roads on the way home from work rather than on the way to work tomorrow. With heavy snow expected, most regions will start off at sub-zero temperatures. 서울 at -2, 대전 and Daegu -4 degrees. As for daily highs, Seoul will get up to 2 degrees, Gyeongju and Busan 9 degrees Celsius. Snow and rain will gradually move away from the northwest areas on Wednesday morning. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world. Now to Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.
Children's laughter, hope, dream. K-animation belongs in them. Interesting and valuable story that transcends between everyday life and dream. Surprising spectacle where imagination becomes real. An array of subjects catering from infants to adolescents. For our story to reach all corners of the world. K-animation makes healthy laughter for children. Completely new. But something anyone can relate with. Flawlessly made. And tears that go with it. K-drama. Korea is coming at you with another story to tell.
진행입니다. 스탠바이. 스타트.
Hello everyone, welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. On the very first day of 2024, a powerful earthquake with a preliminary magnitude of 7.6 struck Japan. It has already been a week since the Noto Peninsula in Ishikawa prefecture was hit by the country's deadliest earthquake in nearly 8 years since Kumamoto earthquakes in 2016. But there are still hundreds of people missing. Rescue operations continue, but due to adverse weather and the fact that it is a peninsula region with low accessibility, they are being hampered. How is the current situation in quake-hit central Japan? For this, we have Walter Sim, Japan correspondent from the Straits Times. Thank you for your time, Walter.
My pleasure.
All right, Walter, first question. It has already been a week since a massive earthquake hit Japan's Noto Peninsula. What is the death toll and how many are still missing? And is it true that it is difficult for humanitarian aid to reach most areas due to severe weather conditions right now?
Yes, indeed, it has been a week since the New Year's Day earthquake, as you pointed out, and the situation remains extremely dire on the Noto Peninsula, which some in Japan have referred to as an island on land. So you could just imagine how difficult it is to get there. I'm currently now in Ishikawa prefecture and have been spending time yesterday and today within the hardest hit areas, speaking to survivors, and many of them have told me that the earthquake was unlike anything that they have ever experienced before. The latest toll as of this afternoon was 168 dead and 323 people unaccounted for. And I think the death toll looks set to rise as rescue teams race against the clock to look for more survivors to dig through collapsed buildings. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's government has indeed said that the aid is difficult to reach the hardest hit areas, as you have pointed out in the question. I do think there is some truth to this, and personally, driving into and out of the quake areas has really been quite a nightmare because of terrible road conditions and icy roads following last night's blizzard, for instance. Air and sea access is also quite limited because of the very rough terrain and waters in the region. But that said, however, I think not everyone agrees with Prime Minister Kishida's assessment, and his response has been criticized as slow, particularly amongst people with experienced volunteers, for instance, and especially the evacuees. And I think that there are grounds for this criticism because at least 2,000 people are still isolated and absolutely no relief, no food, no water has reached them, and it's been a week since the earthquake. There's also not enough food and water for survivors in many evacuation shelters in the worst hit areas, let alone other things that I think you and I take for granted, such as electricity and heating. So I think the situation is really very bad.
All right, I see. Thank you for your update, Walter. It's quite unfortunate to hear that situation has not improved that much. Walter, since the 7.6 magnitude rattled the Ishikawa prefecture, I saw the report said aftershocks had been hitting the region. Could you tell us more about the tremors and aftershocks the region has been seeing?
Yes, it has really been very bad. There have reportedly been over 1,000 aftershocks that measure at least one on Japan's own Shindo seismic intensity scale. So most of the aftershocks, however, have been weak to moderate earthquakes, though one last night had a magnitude of 4.7. It's also worth pointing out, I think, that before the big earthquake hit on New Year's Day, there were as many as 500 tremors experienced by the Noto Peninsula before the big one. So I think the fear is that the earthquakes prior to the New Year's Day quake, as well as the New Year's Day tremor, and the aftershocks now would cause even more damage because it would have weakened the foundations of buildings. Another considerable factor that you pointed out earlier that has been hampering rescue and relief efforts is really bad weather. The blizzard that pounded Noto Peninsula last night has accumulated so much snow that it's a clear landslide risk. Icy roads have hampered relief efforts of vehicles going in and out the region, and the accumulated snow could also cause more buildings to collapse under the weight.
All right, I see, Walter. I'd like to also ask you about the impact on nuclear power. When the massive 9.0 magnitude quake previously hit Japan in 2011, it triggered a tsunami that swamped the Fukushima nuclear power plant at that time. And so this recent quake also raised concerns over potential damage to nuclear plants. Was any damage reported right now?
Thankfully, this time, the nuclear power plants in the region seem to have escaped major damage. The plant operators have all said that there has not been any external radiation detected. Naturally, I think such a major earthquake would raise questions over the safety of nuclear as a power source, but much of the Japanese public opinion, I think, has shifted in favor of nuclear because it's crucial for Japan to have any chance of reaching its net zero carbon neutrality goals by 2050, as well as, inflation due to external events like the Russia-Ukraine war also means that nuclear power is pretty much the only green option that Japan has right now to keep electricity costs down. So I think that's why, whilst public opinion has once been very much against nuclear power, in the wake of the 2011 earthquake, it's now shifting in favor of it.
All right, I see. Well, it's quite fortunate to hear that no damage has been reported regarding this nuclear power plant. Walter, many regions and countries offered aid, as far as I know, but Japan reportedly decided to only receive aid from the U.S. Is there any specific reason for this, and how have discussions developed so far regarding getting aid from Washington?
Indeed, I kind of get the sense, to be honest, that Mr. Kishida's government seems to have been caught on the back foot by the exact scale and extent of damage in the region, and I think he's kind of trying to make up for things, having faced a lot of criticism, especially from on the ground, from evacuees and from experienced volunteers who say that even more could have been done. As you highlighted out earlier, humanitarian aid is indeed difficult to reach the hardest hit areas on land, but there have been voices asking why is aid not being dispatched by sea or by air. So I think the government is kind of, the Mr. Kishida's government kind of have to balance things on these fronts, whilst there are truths that, it's very difficult to access the area by land, but I think he is also trying to grapple with the need to identify more routes, more avenues to bring relief aid in. The hardest hit areas, to be frank, are not quite capable of housing large numbers of volunteers, it seems. And I think this is one primary reason why Japan is reluctant to, have large numbers of foreign volunteers come in at this point. Nonetheless, I do think that, the US is, after all, Japan's only ally. And I guess Mr. Kishida finds it a natural fit for Japan to look towards the US in times of need. I'm not quite sure what special considerations were given to the US's offer, though, or in what ways, America's offer might have differed from those of other countries and regions. So I can't quite comment on that. I'm sorry.
All right, I see, Walter. Well, I believe this would be our last question. We have been keep talking about Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's efforts, though there could be differing views. Could you tell us what plans for rescue and relief have been drafted up until now, and how will victims be assisted?
Right. I think the most immediate measure that Mr. Kishida's government is planning is to designate the disaster as an extremely severe one during a cabinet meeting tomorrow. So what that would do is to unlock funds in terms of special financial aid and give the government more leeway in terms of dispersing relief and financial aid to the hardest hit areas. So that's going to happen tomorrow. Besides that, Mr. Kishida has also drastically increased the number of self-defense forces troops on the ground. From the initial 1,000 that were deployed on January 1st, the government has raised the number of soldiers to 6,400 in hopes of speeding up the restoration and relief efforts. I do think, however, that one key turning point to watch out for will be when the runway of Noto Airport is finally repaired. The airport is, as of now, scheduled to reopen on January 24th, and that will naturally offer another route into the area other than land for relief efforts to go in.
All right. Well, that's all I have for you, Walter. Well, hopefully Japan can quickly recover from the damage and those affected will be able to return to their daily lives as soon as they can. Thank you for the update, Walter.
Thank you very much.
All right, we have asked Walter about the status quo in Japan after the recent massive earthquake. Let's now turn to an expert to ask the reason why such a quake occurred on the western side of Japan and whether this was a sign of a much bigger earthquake to come. We also aim to ask what South Korea needs to do in order to prevent such natural disasters. And for this, we invite Professor Chung Seok-Koo from Changwon National University. Welcome to the show, Professor Chung.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, my name is Seok-Koo.
All right, Professor Chung. Until now, major earthquakes with a magnitude of 7 or higher in Japan have mainly occurred on the eastern side, as far as I know, such as the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. Why was there such a big earthquake on the western side of Japan this time?
Japan, as you know, is one of the most seismically active countries located at the plate boundary. Earthquakes are very common at plate boundaries, and the eastern and the southern side of Japan are right on the boundaries, and that's why they have lots of large earthquakes. As you move away from these boundaries, earthquakes become obviously much less frequent. But the western side of Japan, in my opinion, is still not far enough away, meaning that they can still get large earthquakes, just not as frequent as right on the boundaries. In fact, there has been a number of moderate-sized earthquakes which did some damage, and some people seem to suggest that the Noto Peninsula earthquakes is likely part of an ongoing earthquake swarm that started in 2020. And from this, it seems that this earthquake was going to happen, and it was just a matter of time.
All right, I see. Professor Chung, you have already mentioned that Japan is the birthplace of seismology and that it sits on the Ring of Fire. And so Japan is well known as a country that is well prepared for such earthquakes. But why has the aftermath of the recent quake been difficult for Japan to deal with?
Yes, Japan is very seismically active, and it is known to be well prepared for earthquakes. They have a lot of experience, and I'm sure that they are doing their best to deal with the aftermath of this earthquake. But looking at the information that I can find, this earthquake was extremely intense. Seismic stations near the epicenter recorded very large accelerations, and some of them show up to almost 3 times the gravitational acceleration, which is not very common to find. And near the epicenter, the recorded seismic intensity was 7, which is the highest in the Japanese intensity scale. Unfortunately, several populated areas in Noto Peninsula were exposed to this strong shaking, which led to the collapse of many buildings. The strong shaking also damaged infrastructure, leading to the disruption of transportation network and water and power supply. And many buildings caught fire, which adds up and which can be, and this fire can be caused by the damage to gas pipes and power lines. And during the earthquake, many homes were destroyed, especially older timber buildings, which weren't up to the seismic standard. And some people managed to evacuate, but a lot of them would have been trapped inside waiting to be rescued. Timing is critical for such rescue efforts, but emergency services are being hindered by the damaged roads, lack of communication, and buildings being burned down.
Oh, I see.
And all these things make situation very difficult.
Right. Thank you for your explanation, Professor Chung. According to the Japan's Geospatial Information Authority, the powerful earthquake caused crosstalk changes of up to 3 meters in the Noto region. The Korean Peninsula has not seen any impact from it yet, fortunately, but what happens when there are crosstalk changes, and if there were any, what impact could it have had on the Korean Peninsula?
Yes, crustal movement can permanently change the topography. In fact, this earthquake has lifted some part of the Noto Peninsula, and it is known that the coastline advanced up to 20 meters offshore because of this earthquake. So such large crustal deformation can have some practical implications. For example, the locations of survey control points would be shifted, which means that they will then need to be re-established afterwards. Another concern is that it can impact the marine environment. And one example is that in 2016 Kaikoura, New Zealand earthquake, the seabed was raised because of the earthquake by several meters. Then thousands of marine creatures were exposed and they were left to die. And some people estimated that it will take more than 10 years for them to get back to normal. So, and typically, large crustal deformation occurs in the vicinity of faults that have slipped. And according to a published study, South Korea experienced up to 55 millimeters of crustal deformation due to the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. So it wasn't as large as what was recorded at the epicenter region. But I think the crustal deformation of South Korea caused by the Noto Peninsula earthquake would be much smaller because this earthquake is much smaller earthquake compared with the 2011 Tohoku earthquake.
All right, I see, Professor Chung. I'd like to also ask you about South Korea. South Korea is no longer a safe zone from earthquakes as well. And in fact, the data revealed that earthquakes with a magnitude of 2.0 or higher on the Korean Peninsula and its surrounding waters increased by more than 20% compared to the previous year in 2023. How concerning is this? And if it is concerning, what should the South Korean government do in order to be better prepared for this?
The long-term seismicity can fluctuate due to many reasons. For example, published studies reported increased seismicity in the Korean Peninsula after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. Still, South Korea is in a stable continental region, which means that it is not as seismically active as some other countries. However, low seismicity regions can get damaging earthquakes. 2016 Gyeongju and 2017 Pohang earthquakes are really good examples of such cases, and there are other examples in other countries as well. The problem is that we have been only recording earthquakes in South Korea for 50 years or so, and people who never experienced strong earthquakes in their lifetime, as it was the case in Noto Peninsula earthquake, they don't consider earthquake as a potential threat, and until they experience one, then it might be too late, right?
All right, I see. Professor Chung, may I ask if there is anything South Korean government could do in order to better prepare for this?
Right. I realized that after the Noto Peninsula earthquake, the government announced a plan to reinforce major public facilities by 2035. I looked at the plan and I like to say that public facilities are easier to retrofit because the government owns them. But case study shows that the major loss is actually from the private buildings. Now, older buildings without proper seismic reinforcement are a major cause of fatalities, as it was shown in Noto Peninsula case. Most of these are residential buildings and smaller commercial buildings. The government plan includes encouragement for seismic retrofitting of private buildings, which seems to include incentives. I doubt the effectiveness of this policy, and the reason is that people who live in vulnerable buildings are usually unable to afford the retrofitting cost. After the 2017 Pohang earthquake, for example, many people had to evacuate because their homes became uninhabitable. They could not afford to fix their homes. They could not afford to move to other places. I think the government needs to consider implementing a policy that can boost disaster insurance penetration, so that affected people can actually afford to pay for the repair or relocation after the disaster.
All right, I see, Professor Chung. Now, before we wrap up the show, could you share information about what steps we need to follow in order to be safe when earthquakes and tsunamis hit?
Right. Korean government, to be specific, Ministry of Interior and Safety has published a really good manual with extensive information about what to do in an earthquake event. I think people need to be aware of potential disaster risks in their surroundings in general. Damaging earthquakes can happen in Korea, and if a moderately large magnitude 6 earthquake strike any major city in Korea, it can do a lot of damage. And studies suggest that we cannot completely rule out such an event. In general, when you get an intense shaking, you need to drop cover and hold, and you will need to evacuate to a wide open space immediately after the shaking has stopped. Tsunami-wise, only very large earthquakes can generate significant tsunami, and it is unlikely, I think, that we will get a tsunami from a domestic earthquake. But a large earthquake in the western Japan may generate a tsunami that can impact the east coast of Korean Peninsula. In that case, we will likely get a warning, and when that happens, we will need to move higher up away from the coast as quickly as possible.
All right, thank you for your safety tips, Professor Chung. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Chung, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.